We're a nation in decline.
We're in decline? Donald Trump said that when campaigning, and now that he's president, the left agrees. Because of Trump, America faces
the collapse of democracy. It's not where we're headed, it's where we are.
Are we witnessing the fall of democracy in the American empire? Are we doomed to collapse like ancient Rome? The new book, Peak Human, covers what we might learn from Rome and other empires like Ancient Athens, China's Song Dynasty, the Italian Renaissance. Here's my extended interview with the author, historian Johan Norberg. Peak Human. Are we peak now?
I think we live in a golden age, for sure. We have never had so many people living lives in freedom, longer lives, in better health, more wealth than at any other point in human history. And I would very much like to extend that golden age a bit. And that's a reason why I write about lessons from history.
You look at 7 golden ages. There are more.
You could find golden ages in most places, in most civilizations throughout history, because it's not really in comparison to their neighbors, their rivals. It's compared to what they would otherwise have been. Do we make the best of ourselves, of the culture that we've got here? So it's not a clash between civilization, it's a clash within every civilization on whether they should keep going, being more open to innovation and progress, or whether they should retreat and decline.
But nobody says we're going to retreat.
No, they usually say, oh, we want stability, we want protection, we want someone to take care of us. But that's the same thing, because that's what leads to stagnation, because it shuts you off from all those experiments, all that exchange that would have helped you to find something new, acquire new capacity, and keep going.
You have to keep poking people, changing things, and people in power don't like that.
This is the major problem. Why would elites ever be happy about change? They've built their power on a particular system of production, certain ideas, a particular mentality, whereas trade, innovation, growth, it's all about change. It's about people doing better things tomorrow than they did today. But that, of course, ruffles the feathers. And that's
Some people are losers in that freedom.
For sure. But of course, if you then stick to what you have always been doing, then you will lose out. And we have the same kind of reactionary mentality today when vested interests and politicians, they don't like ride-sharing apps because that introduces a new form of competition.
Taxi drivers in France are holding a nationwide strike today to protest against ride-sharing companies like Uber.
We are demanding that the city of Cincinnati ban UberX and Lyft.
And obviously, if you do something better and cheaper, someone else who does things in an old and probably more expensive way is going to lose out.
Golden ages implies that they're nearly perfect, but I mean, they weren't totally golden. There was slavery, women were abused, cruelty, poor people did really badly.
Let me first of all say they're not golden in every way for everyone. All of these historical civilizations in ancient times, in the Middle Ages, they all had oppression, they all had slavery, they all gave women fewer, if any, rights. But that's not something that their neighbors were surprised by, because every civilization throughout history has been doing that. Oppression and poverty was the rule throughout history. What sets these golden ages apart is that for a period of time, they managed to lift themselves above that and give more people more freedoms. And that also allowed them to experiment more and come up with better technologies and raise the living standards for more people.
Having had that success, I think the people would keep it.
You would think that they'd keep it, but often they don't, because change and dynamic civilizations also introduces a certain element of uncertainty and worry, because you don't know what's going to happen next. And lots of people want security. They want to know what happens next. So often in times of trouble, they're asking for a strong man to protect them and slow things down. And that's why we often see at the end of these civilizations that they try to freeze economic relations, stop new competition, cut the trade routes, because they want stability. And they get stability, but they also get stagnation and poverty.
It's counterintuitive. Greece led the world. Rome led the world. You'd think they'd keep it.
It's easy to see once you've lost something great that it was great. But once you're living in it, you constantly see the problems, you complain about things not being perfect, and that's a good thing. That keeps us moving forward and solving more problems. But unfortunately, sometimes you just begin to question everything that is going on, all the institutions that gave you that progress in the past. And then there is a risk that you begin to sacrifice those institutions for something that's much worse. That's something we've seen in history. People often wanted some sort of safety, stability, protection, and then, yes, they slow things down, they get that stability, but they also get stagnation and poverty.
And other people just pass them by.
That's right. That's right. And you also notice that no place is guaranteed to have constant progress. Golden ages appear in unlikely places. Often the area that was seen as barbaric during one era becomes the golden age in the next one.
Talk about your visiting Athens.
I was so excited to visit Athens for the first time, the cradle of civilization, going then to these legendary places, the Democratic Assembly, Plato's and Aristotle's Academy, and expected to get some of that sense of energy. And I was so tremendously disappointed because it all looks quite unimpressive, abandoned. It looks less like the cradle of civilization, more like an abandoned parking lot in some of those places. And that set my mind racing, beginning to think about how could this place for a while have been the center of the earth? And how do they lose that spark of energy and of excitement eventually? And since then, I couldn't get this out of my mind, how you create golden ages, but also how you lose them.
No other city has shaped the Western world so much as Athens.
Why is ancient Athens considered a golden age?
Because Athens gave us so much.
Ancient Greece is widely acknowledged as the birthplace of democracy.
In its golden age, it became a flourishing center of art and philosophy.
They invented, obviously, philosophy, invented an idea about democracy, but also the science of history. They invented drama, both comedy and tragedy. They invented forms of architecture and sculpture that still amazes. And that was because they gave their people more freedom than other Greek city-states. They were a maritime city. They always ventured out because they had to acquire the food that they needed.
They had bad soil, and that helped them?
Athens had terrible soil. They couldn't get enough food from their own land. So they had to import that from other places, from areas around the Black Sea. And that was actually a good thing, because it meant that they had to specialize in things that they could produce. Things like olive trees, gave them olive oil. They could specialize in vines and wine, and therefore they could exchange those things that actually created more value for the grain that they needed. So they became traders and acquired more wealth by specializing in something that they could do much better. They became maritime. They were always on the lookout for better ideas and better technologies in other places, and that constantly gave them a boost of energy and innovation back home. Actually, economists have tried to use modern indexes of economic freedom to try to investigate what the Athenian economy was about. And they've found that for the free men in Athens, economic freedom, property rights, the freedom to trade, to do business, was greater than in any country in the world today.
Ahead of Hong Kong, New Zealand, Singapore?
Ahead of them all. If ancient Athens had been here today, we would have thought that this was a sort of market fundamentalist neoliberal experiment. Obviously, you have to have a reservation for the fact that slaves and women didn't have the same kind of freedoms. But for free men in ancient Athens, they probably had more freedoms than you and I.
Athens was a trading power.
Athenian coins have been found in Egypt. They've been found practically as far away as Afghanistan. Goods came in from all over the world.
On those business trips, they got better ideas on how to improve things, how to invent new things. And that gave them a sense of intellectual innovation that's probably unique at that time in human history. They began to think that it's actually a good thing to invent new things and to say that you do that, you're competitive. Aristotle said that, look, we should be kind to our teachers like Plato, but we should also treasure truth. And if they're in opposition, we should treasure truth even more than our teachers and our friends. And this is an idea about intellectual innovation that was a new idea in human history.
They were on top, but no longer. So what happened?
There's this Greek concept about hubris. If you're on top of the world, you think you can do anything, even defy the gods. That's what the Athenians did. They thought that they could begin to push people around and build an empire. And they did. And so they began to abandon their ideas of voluntary relationships and free trade, and instead bully other Greek city-states into doing what they wanted. And that was very costly, but it also created a lot of pushback. They alienated many other Greek city-states who began to gang up against Athens because of this. And that's a lesson from history. You can be a bully and push others into doing what you want to do by threatening them, and you might win out in the short term, but longer term, all those victims, they will begin to think that we don't like these guys, and we'll try to hurt them when we get a chance.
This is Sparta!
Hollywood sometimes glorifies the bullies. The Spartans are the greatest warriors. There's this movie 300.
Spartans, the finest soldiers the world has ever known.
The Spartans were the most overrated warriors in history. The myth about the Spartans were that they were the bravest soldiers in history. They always fought the hardest and they never surrendered. They'd rather return back home on their shields than with their shields, as the saying goes.
It's a myth about the 300?
When it comes to that heroic stand of 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, first of all, they weren't 300. They were probably some 5,000 because they had other allied Greek troops. And it wasn't a great success in holding the Persians off. On the contrary, it was a terrible failure. If they had held them off for another few days, the Persians would have run out of food and they had to return back home. But unfortunately, they were so incompetent, so they left a mountain trail unguarded so that the Persians could surround them and attack them from both sides. And it didn't give Greece the time to sort of gather forces to beat the Persians because they thought that the Spartans should have been there for at least a week to hold them off. So what really saved Greeks against the Persians, that was the Athenians, because they found the best way to fight back. It was the Battle of Salamis, and it was a naval attack on the Persians, where the Athenian soldiers and the Marines constantly came up with new tricks and coming up with new methods, new strategy and tactic, the very thing that the Spartans didn't do. The Spartans, they were unimaginative. They often tried this very same thing over and over again. They never experimented. They never came up with naval warfare, siege warfare, or managed logistics, or combined weapons, or anything like that. The Athenians, on the other hand, they constantly learned and adapted. They were flexible, and that's how they beat the Persians.
This is where we hold them! This is where we fight!
I think actually it was the Athenians who came up with that myth, partly because the history of Sparta was written by Athenian aristocrats who didn't like the vulgar democracy back home in Athens. They kind of admired this closed authoritarian system where a few Spartan oligarchs could do whatever they wanted in their territory. The Athenians, they were the opposite of Spartans. They were open-minded, they were innovative, and they were also full of trickery and deceit. And they came up with this myth about, look at these great Spartans, they were only 300 and they managed to hold off the Persians. If they did that, how cowardly wouldn't we be, other Greeks, if we didn't stand up against the Persians? So that was actually a way to convince other Spartans to keep fighting the Persians when they wanted to flee.
So after Greece, Rome. rose?
Rome was a tiny, insignificant city on the Italian peninsula until they came up with the best method of expanding their society.
Rome began as an Etruscan peasant village. The village grew to become the capital of a huge empire, extending from Britain to North Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Black Sea.
And apparently American men are fascinated by this.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Well, at least twice a day.
What?
On social media, there are all these videos where women are surprised how often the guys in their lives think about ancient Rome.
How many times a week do you think about the Roman Empire?
Like 30.
30 times a week?
What's that about?
Apparently, men think about Rome every day because there's so much to think about. They gave us so many things that we still now take for granted. I mean, the urban grid in Manhattan, Christianity in its traditional forms, the Latin languages. They also, I mean, there's a reason why we have a Senate and they meet in the Capitol. We borrow those ideas and the words from the Romans. We borrow much of architecture, many of the ideas about law, including words, concepts like pro bono or habeas corpus from the Romans. So there's much to think about.
The survey shows 13% of men think about Rome every week, 30% once a month. Why men?
I actually interviewed the guy who started this meme, Gaius Flavius. He's a Roman reenactor. You can see him on social media dressing up as a Roman soldier. And he said that it's not just about war and soldiers. Actually, if you have a legal education, you probably think about Roman law. If you're into engineering, you think about the amazing aqueducts.
Rome's system of water distribution was a quantum leap to anything which had come before it.
In the capital city, 11 aqueduct lines guided a steady stream of fresh water to its citizens.
The architecture the Romans built.
The Colosseum's engineering treasures, Roman architecture never ceases to amaze us.
If you're thinking about climate change, you think about the late Roman warm period, which was a period of very impressive yields in agriculture in Rome. The Romans set so many things into motion. And there are so many things that we talk about today that has its origins in the Roman Empire. And that's a reason to think of it. Perhaps more often than we do.
I suspect men are mostly interested in the military.
We often think of warfare, the fact that they were brutal warriors, and they were. But so were everybody else. What made the Romans different? The difference was that they weren't just efficient warriors. They also constantly absorbed new talent, new ideas, new technologies from other places. They were experts when it came to strategic tolerance. They gave people among the subjected the ability to have a second career in Rome. They made them citizens and allowed them to do business, to have a career in the military, even in the Senate. Some of the subjected peoples could even end up being emperors of Rome. That's how Rome constantly renewed itself with fresh blood.
The conquered, some became emperors?
It happened. Some of the immigrants, some of the conquered, even the son of a freed slave eventually ended up on the throne of Rome. And that tells you something about the power of meritocracy and of openness. You'll get the best brains if you're open to more people. They always learned new technologies, new business models from other groups. And that wasn't because they were kind of decent, kind, open-minded. That was because tolerance was a weapon, often literally a weapon. They got their Spanish swords from the Spaniards. They got their ships from Carthage. They learned constantly about how to arm themselves, how to organize their legions by other peoples. And therefore, step by step, they always learned, they always acquired new capacity, and therefore they could become the masters of the world.
They also had like running water and sewage treatment for the first time. Are there Can you talk about some of those practical things that help me understand what was golden about Rome?
Because Rome was such a huge integrated free trade area. You could source the best material, the best technology from any part of the empire. So you could come up with the best way of producing concrete, for example. And then you could build ports, you could build amazing buildings like the Parthenon, the biggest unreinforced dome ever, and they could build aqueducts, bringing in fresh water to Rome from other parts of the empire. Amazing aqueducts that still stands to this day. And according to historians who look at this, the access to fresh water, the ways of building, paved roads, even things like fire services, was something that Europe would not have again for some 1,500 years.
But then Rome, too, fell.
Yes, and ever since we've thought about why that happened. And people always want their own favorite explanation. One German historian collected all the reasons that have been mentioned for the fall of Rome in the 1980s, and he came up with more than 200 causes of the fall of Rome. So perhaps we have even too many explanations for it. But to me, it's quite obvious that Rome fell just like, Ernest Hemingway has a bankruptcy in two ways. First gradually and then suddenly. It wasn't just about barbarians invading Rome in the 5th century. It was because the Romans had already weakened their empire for a very long time. And one way in which they did that was that they abandoned their ideas of having much of local self-determination and freedom, and instead they began to centralize their empire to the capital, to the emperor, who became much more of a military dictator, basically. And he started to control economic relationships, he started to tax people more viciously, he started to debase the coinage and unleash inflation, and then impose price controls to try to get rid of this. And that failed. So all of these things meant that Rome, instead of having so many different provinces, so many different power centers and also engines of growth and of innovation, instead they had a single point of failure. The emperor, whenever he began to lose out for some reason, it meant that you didn't have that local capacity, that you didn't have a plan B to sort of keep it going. And then it became the victim of invasions from all sides.
In the United States, the Speaker of the House of Representatives blames homosexuality.
Many historians would look back and give some credit to the fall of Rome to not only the deprivation of the society, but also to the rampant, homosexual behavior that was condoned by the society.
Which begs the question why it took 1,000 years of rampant homosexual behavior to end the Roman experiment.
You say entitlement spending played a big role.
The concept of bread and circuses, the emperors wanted to become popular by handing out free stuff to people. Originally, this started small. You just handed the very poor means of subsistence, make sure that they would survive. But that group was enlarged because it was popular. You want free olive oil or even free bread. So the group that lived on the public's expense grew larger all the time. And emperors complained about this constantly while they were expanding it. Everyone from Caesar and onward said, we've got to reform this system because it means that we have fewer people working and more people consuming. But no one succeeded. Instead, it was expanded all the time, became more and more costly. So the Romans could conquer the world, but they couldn't do entitlement reform.
Once people had their free bread, somebody who threatened to take that away was in trouble.
Yeah, that's not how you become popular. You need to give them, if you want to be popular next time around, you need to give them more bread and more circuses, more gladiators in the arena. That's what they found. Even though they were quite ruthless emperors who weren't elected. They were constantly dependent on the popularity of the populace. They realized that the quickest way to their hearts was through their stomachs.
It just reminds me of what I see in the West now about pensions.
Nationwide protests and strikes against the government's controversial pension reforms.
Even countries that are going broke, they can't raise the retirement age.
It's a very worrying sign in each of these civilizations. Once you have an ever-expanding system of entitlements that you can't afford, then you have to deal with it in different ways. Well, some of them just try to conquer other peoples and take their stuff. But once you run out of that, you have to resort to inflation. Rome started to debase the currency. They had less silver in every coin, which led to spiraling inflation that ruined economic relationships all over the Roman Empire. In a way, inflation was much worse than barbarian invaders. And the solution that they come up with was counterproductive. The Emperor Diocletian, he blamed greedy businessmen for inflation, something that we hear today as well. So he imposed price controls on more than 1,000 goods, from furniture to living lions, and even imposed the death penalty on any merchant that increased the price above a certain level. But obviously it all failed because he kept debasing the currency. So inflation kept going, prices kept rising. It only happened in the shadow economy and undermined the Roman Empire completely.
Some people will be surprised to hear Muslims had a golden age.
The Islamic Empire made incredible advances in science, and many of these discoveries have shaped our modern world, giving us things like cataract surgery and algebra.
In the 9th century, the leading civilization on the planet when it came to science, technology, and freedom was actually the Muslim Empire, the Abbasid dynasty with its capital in Baghdad. They had created a huge free trade area from North Africa to Central Asia and Afghanistan.
The Arabs got rid of Roman numerals and went to the numbers we use today.
The Arab civilization was a very commercial one, where merchants were treated with lots of respect. Muhammad was a merchant, so they constantly traded and they were allowed to have flexible prices that weren't regulated, and that gave them lots of wealth, but it also made them interested in finding better ways, more efficient ways to deal with risk, with calculations. So they abandoned the traditional numeral system and came up with the Arabic numerals, which are the ones that we use, Arabic Indian numerals, which makes all forms of addition, subtraction, any kind of business much, much easier. And that's what Italian merchants learned when they were trading with the Arabs. Very different from many Muslim countries today in the way that they were tolerant. They were open to new ideas. They invited scholars and thinkers from other countries, Christians and Jews and of other Muslim denominations. At that time, they translated all the books they could lay their hands on from ancient Greece and onwards, because they thought that the best way to acquire more ideas, more capacity in everything from astronomy to how to do business was to learn from others. And the best way to prove them wrong was to have an open debate about it if they were mistaken in some way. So they became the most dynamic culture. This was the place where scholars from all over Eurasia wanted to travel, to do research and to debate.
So how do you go from welcoming these ideas to banning them and banning the books and killing people with other ideas?
The rise of the Islamic State followed with even greater atrocities. Minority faiths, now considered infidels, were forced to convert to Islam or face death.
Eventually, unfortunately, the rulers realized that exploiting religion for political purposes is very potent. It makes it possible for you to divide and conquer, set groups against groups and say, we are the only real interpreters of true Islam and the others are opponents. So what they did eventually was that they set up a system of state schools that weren't open to different ideas, but where you had to repeat a certain orthodoxy. And all of those scholars who used to be independent, and they were often in civil society, doing business in various ways, they became basically state employees. They got a fixed wage from the government, and that's great, but on the condition that they left all their critical thinking behind. So they replaced openness with orthodoxy and began to ban books and to persecute dissidents.
Baghdad declined and China rose.
Ancient China reigned supreme as the world's technological superpower. It was during the Song period that the four great inventions of papermaking, printing, the compass, and gunpowder were further developed, technologies that spread across the world and changed it permanently.
It's interesting, Karl Marx said in the 19th century that there are three great inventions that have ushered in the bourgeois era and modern capitalism, and that's gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and it is the printing press. All of these things were there in China 1,000 years ago. And yes, it ushered in a kind of a bourgeois era back then as well, because this was under the Song Dynasty in China. And they had more freedom than other Chinese dynasties had in that society, more of openness to new ideas from strange places. So they commercialized society. Farmers, they owned their own secure property, and they were allowed to experiment with new grain, with new forms of rice from Vietnam and so on, and to trade with others. So they came up with constant new innovations, and it became a very urbanized society that ushered in incredible experiments when it came to iron, steel, textile machines. Some economic historians even think that they could have had an industrial revolution some 400 or 500 years before the British did.
I thought Gutenberg in Europe invented the printing press.
He came up with his own version, but probably after having heard about Chinese and Korean models. Eventually, he did his own thing, and people began to think that this is a European invention. That goes for many inventions in history.
Back to China. The government scrapped laws on what could be sold, allowed markets to stay open all night, which wasn't allowed before.
Yeah, in traditional Chinese society, people had fixed areas where they were allowed to live and where they had to return after having done a day's work, so that people did not mingle and meet people from other classes, other professions, and you were only allowed to go out after the drums had beaten loudly and the doors were open and people went out into the market. What happened under the Song Dynasty was that the walls were torn down, and they were actually torn down by urban citizens themselves. They began to dig holes under the walls. They began to mingle with one another after the drums had beaten, so that they could do more business, so that they could listen to concerts, so that they could go to religious ceremonies. And then eventually Chinese society realized that this is how you make progress. This is how we become wealthier. When more people meet, when more people exchange goods and services and ideas, they begin to prosper. So they began to tear these walls down and instead allow people to turn cities into basically all-night open markets. This is a unique hand scroll painting which shows an incredibly dynamic marketplace. Hundreds of people bustling, talking, trading, producing stuff, farming. They're on ships, they're in restaurants, they're in the farm fields. There are comedians, jugglers, monks. They do business, they talk, they travel, they even have giraffes. They have goods from all over the world, because this is the most capitalist city on the planet back then 1,000 years ago. Everything is going on everywhere all at once.
It looks like a Where's Waldo book. I mean, there's even food delivery.
Yes, sometimes you lose knowledge and you lose creative business models for a very long time, because If the economy tanks, if the civilization becomes less open, you become poorer and you lose much of that division of labor. More people just have to work in farming just to keep people alive. And then you lose many of these trades, many of these professions. You might even lose food delivery drivers.
The Chinese had all this, but then they banned foreign trade, ocean voyages, stifled the experimentation that made them rich.
One important lesson from history is don't get invaded by Mongols. That started the decline of the great Chinese Song experiment, because once the Mongol hordes had invaded China, they wanted to keep that wealth. They liked what they saw, but they just didn't know how to do it because they were warlords rather than merchants and scholars. So step by step, they began to undermine the engines of growth, commerce, trade, and so on. And it became much, much worse eventually when, after a period of civil strife, the new Ming Dynasty took control of China. And they wanted to restore stability. That was their one big idea. We want stability after all this uncertainty and chaos. And how do we do that? We do that by trying to regulate everything, by telling people to stay in their places, rebuild the walls, and abandon ocean trade, eventually banning international trade altogether. And sure, they got stability. And they also got 500 years of stagnation, 500 years that turned the richest and greatest civilization on the planet to a desperately poor country.
And the richest civilization became Italy.
Yeah, in the 14th and 15th century, the small Italian city-states became the richest on the planet. And they ushered in the Renaissance, which eventually turned into a scientific revolution in Europe. And they did that not by trying to revive some specific Italian tradition. They did that by borrowing the best ideas from others. So they were merchants. They were constantly trading with the Arabs. And when the Pope said, no, you shouldn't trade with Muslims, they said, oh, trade should be free all the way to the gates of hell. And that gave them wealth. It also gave them good ideas on how to do business and how to use Arabic numerals, for example. They also heard all these great stories about China. Marco Polo and other adventurers had traveled there and talked about amazing wealth over there. And they wanted to recreate something like that in Italy. And that opened up minds to doing things in new ways, both when it comes to business. They started new experiments in everything from the financial capitalism to experiments in arts. So they began to use perspective in new ways, new forms of oil painting that made it possible for artists to think a bit harder and change and recreate things after they've thought about it a bit longer.
American conservatives say progress happened because of Christianity.
Western civilization is Christian civilization.
The biblical stories are the foundation of Western culture.
If that were the case, it's very difficult to explain why nothing happened in Italy for almost 1,000 years. So that form of Christianity back then, in a more authoritarian form, had instead kept us away from experimenting, innovating, thinking freely in strange new ways. What opened up minds and created the Renaissance was that they began to learn from other civilizations. They traded with Muslims, they learned from the Chinese civilization, and they also began to rediscover the pagan traditions of Greece and of the Roman Empire. And back then, in the 14th and in the 15th century, the first reaction of the Christian church was to say that, oh, this is awful. You shouldn't be doing all of these strange things. You'll come up with strange new technologies and forms of arts that we haven't had here before, and that's a bad thing. But obviously the great paradox for any reactionary is that they are now trying to conserve something that previous generations of reactionaries failed to stop.
Galileo was dragged in front of the Inquisition, threatened with torture. He recanted.
Once the Christian church and some of the leading rulers in Europe realized that they could exploit religion for political purposes. And they certainly did after we had the Reformation and different churches began to do battle. They began to divide and conquer and became much more repressive. And then those thinkers and scientists who had for a while had a great moment in Europe when they could think and publish freely, they were now the scapegoats. They were now persecuted and sometimes even executed for their thoughts. And that almost ruined the European project for hundreds of years.
Erasmus's books were burned. The Archbishop of Toledo was locked up for 18 years for having leaned toward the opinions of Erasmus. This was real tyranny.
This was an era of competing fanaticisms in the 16th and 17th century in Europe, when churches became more repressive and rulers who now had gunpowder and cannons could undermine the independence of city-states because they could just blow up their city walls and start to create more unified orthodoxies over greater parts of Europe. And that undermined progress. It undermined science in Europe. When John Milton came to visit Galileo after he had abandoned his ideas, after having been persecuted, said that the glory of Italian wits is over. Nothing much happens in Europe anymore because we have all this repression.
Britain rose during the Industrial Revolution.
The United Kingdom, birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, who shaped iron and fire into engines of change.
People don't call the Industrial Revolution a golden age. I think of smokestacks.
That's what people think of. Smokestacks, child labor, and poverty.
This is what kids are taught.
It's in popular culture. It's everywhere. It was in the opening ceremony of the 2012 London Olympics, where they presented a huge stage of pandemonium, the hell of the Industrial Revolution, where the voiceover spoke about the brutal uprooting of rural Britain.
The chaos and the noise of the Industrial Revolution. The brutal uprooting of rural Britain.
And you can see these brutal capitalists in high hats smoking cigars, forcing farmers to leave the land and build huge smokestacks.
It wasn't true?
That's historical amnesia. This is not what happened. People moved a long way to get factory jobs in England, in Scotland, in the early 18th century, because those were the best jobs on offer.
They were starving on the farm.
If those jobs were bad, which they were obviously compared to what we've got, the wages were low, working conditions were bad, and they worked long hours. That tells you everything you need to know about the alternatives that they had back in the past. Work in subsistence agriculture, where bad weather meant crop failure and starvation. Those were awful conditions, and that's why people traveled a long way to get factory jobs.
They chose those jobs.
They did. For the first time, mankind began to escape hunger and destitution. And that's something that we see during the Industrial Revolution as well. In the parts of Britain where they industrialized the fastest, wages began to rise and people began to put food on the table.
It's the opposite of what people think. They think of this oppression, but this lifted the oppression.
People think that this was all about poverty and oppression, because that's what the books from this period was about. That's what the poets and the writers wrote about, that we have awful poverty in Britain. But that's because their minds were suddenly opened to the fact that we had always had destitution and poverty all throughout the world. But now during the Industrial Revolution, for the first time, it looked like a part of the population managed to rise out of it. So what seemed like just sort of the fate of all of mankind was suddenly a social problem that had to be dealt with. We can see this when we read the diaries or sketches of autobiographies written by rural farmers and workers during the Industrial Revolution. What they said was that for the first time, I'm able to put food on the table of my family. For the first time, I managed to have some spare time, some leisure, because we now have much better wages. For the first time, I don't have to be afraid of seeing my children die before I do. The only people who were consistently disappointed with the Industrial Revolution, when we read their own words, were the poets and the writers and the economists, not the workers.
Wages had been the same, poverty wages, for 500 years, and suddenly that changed, and yet that's vilified. I mean, it makes no sense.
It makes no sense. But the reason is that for the first time, people began to see that poverty is a problem. Throughout the whole of human civilization, the poor will always be with us. That's what everybody thought. Now, for the first time, steam and coal and great inventions and steel helped us to produce more, and therefore making the average worker much more productive so that they could get a much better wage. And also, the price of goods, of food and of clothes made it possible for people, even the poor workers, to have an exchange of clothes, to be able to put food on the table of their families. And obviously, once that happened, you begin to look at poverty in a new way. Now it's not something that we will always have here. Now it's a social problem, something that we should do something about. So we shouldn't confuse the fact that we focus on a problem with thinking that this problem has increased in size. On the contrary, the Industrial Revolution was mankind's way out of poverty, hunger, and child labor.
Americans teach that the wealth was created by slavery and colonization of other countries.
You know, all cultures throughout history have unfortunately engaged in slavery and colonialism up until this point. So it's pretty obvious that the first civilization that would rise out of poverty and hunger would also have many sins like that in their past. But this is not what created wealth in Britain during the Industrial Revolution, because Spaniards, the Russians, and others had also engaged in colonialism and slavery. They didn't come up with an industrial revolution. You can steal resources from others. You can steal a horse from somebody else, but that doesn't give you a car. You need inventions. You need innovations. You need to think about how to use resources in a smarter way. And that's what happened during the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Slavery did exist up until that point, but that's not what provided Britain with the great resources. It mostly gave them access to tea and sweetened sugar in their teeth. So slavery and colonialism mostly gave the British bad teeth, not wealth.
The New York Times 1619 Project says slavery was the reason America prospered.
What they forget is that slavery was the norm throughout the world up until this point. In 1619, even in 1776, the rest of the world did not think that it was strange that America had slavery. They all did. What set America apart was not that it had slavery, but that it began to dismantle the system of slavery. The abolitionist movement in New England, even before the American Revolution, was world leading. Britain and America were the leading powers when it came to banning the international slave trade in the early 19th century. And they funded ships to intercept slave ships on the Atlantic to stop this awful trade. And America obviously then eventually fought a civil war to end this institution. So what makes the United States different from other places was not that it had slavery. Everybody did. What sets America apart was that it gave birth to the ideas and the formulations and the documents that says that this is an awful idea, then that we're all born with the rights to freedom and the pursuit of happiness.
And today, I would think most people would say if any country is having a golden age, it's the United States. There's more prosperity than ever before, enormous wealth creation, inventions. People care about the environment for the first time in history. But you say golden ages die.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else in human history than in this point, because we have made such remarkable progress when it comes to expanding freedoms, reducing poverty, increasing life expectancy, and so on. But it takes a conscious effort to keep it going. The American experiment is now 250 years almost. Few golden ages live past their 250th birthday. And that's because there are constant challenges, there are constant problems, of course, but there are also these constant tensions where the institutions of freedom and of progress are controversial. People often want something else. They want a bigger government to protect them, to create stability and protection. And unfortunately, that then undermines the progress, the innovation that we need to keep golden ages going. So if we want a golden age to keep going, we have to fight for it.
And you're optimistic? Listening to you, I would think we're toast, because every civilization gets comfortable and destroys itself. And I see evidence of that as I look around, people trashing capitalism, people saying Western ideas are bad.
Do you like capitalism?
No, I have many critiques of capitalism.
One of the most worrying signs in history is you begin to take wealth and comfort for granted. It's just there, and give us more of it. And then you forget what made it possible to begin with. And you begin to attack the entrepreneurs and the businesses that create this wealth. And that's an obvious way to undermine your civilization. I see a lot of worrying signs right now. All of the things that keep our society innovative. We have a backlash against capitalism, against trade.
We've been ripped off by everybody.
Against migration.
We got to close the border. That's the first thing we got to do.
We have unsustainable debts.
U.S. federal debt is on an unsustainable path.
We have a fear of the world that might result in a longing for strong men to protect us and wreck the rule of law. So all those problems are there. But that doesn't mean that we're doomed. That's a lesson of history as well, that there's so many instances where societies have faced terrible situations and problems, but they've bounced back. And that's very much dependent on what they decided to do. It's not automatic, this sort of decline and fall phase. You can focus minds. You can decide to double down on the institutions of liberal democracy, free markets. And in that case, you can unleash new waves of innovation and of progress. So there is still time. We can still save this golden age.
And I hear conservatives in my audience saying, you're just another impractical libertarian who wants open borders, let everybody in, doesn't care when the Chinese cheat and take away our jobs.
How did the Chinese become successful? They had 500 years of stagnation after having shut their borders during the Ming civilization. The greatest civilization on the planet became a desperately poor country. But in the late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping said, if we want something better tomorrow than today, we have to reform and open up. That was the slogan. So they had to open up their economy. They had to open up to foreign talent so that they could learn, open up to foreign capital. And all of these things gave them access to the brains of other countries, better business models, better technologies, so that they could make tremendous progress over the past 30 years.
They're hardly an open society.
China has the largest video surveillance network in the world.
It also promises greater state control and abuse of power.
It's not an open society, but in certain areas they have been remarkably open. When it comes to certain areas of the economy, like the tech sector, China has been incredibly competitive and innovative because they have given entrepreneurs more freedom. And that's where they made rapid progress, whereas in the state-owned businesses that have been controlled, they've built new rust belts in lots of places. The worry right now in China is that we've seen a recent backlash against this because Xi Jinping is worried that they have too much freedom, too much openness. So he wants to re-centralize their entire system. And that ruins their competitive potential, that ruins these tech companies and might very well usher in stagnation in China again.
China's a good, clear example. But you didn't really answer my question about open immigration harming the country. job competition taking jobs away?
When you look at great civilizations, one of the things that really helped them to make rapid progress was that they were open to talent from other places. That's what the Roman Republic did. That's what the Dutch Republic did. This is what America was based on, opening up its borders for people who wanted to improve their lives, and while doing it also improve the lives of other Americans. Because they have new ideas, they combine their creativity with what they see going on over here, and that is still happening. Probably some 30 to 40% of the increase in productivity in the American economy recently comes from outsiders, immigrants who enter the American economy with new ideas, new talent, and that also then makes other Americans more productive. They don't take their jobs, they give them more ideas, better management ideas, and therefore helps to make the whole of the US much richer.
They take some jobs.
They take some jobs, and that's a good thing. Obviously, you don't think so if they take your job. But if that's because they can do something, if they can improve a certain sector with better ideas or through a better division of labor, that's something that makes the whole American economy more productive and also, according to the data, provides more jobs in the American economy throughout.
Thank you, Johan Norberg.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this longer than usual video. If you want to help us bring you more extended interviews, please click that button.